Some said he had been caught in a house fire, and the flames had melted his skin like an old candle. Others swore he had been struck by lightning as a child, and that the lightning had split directly across the poor boy's face. There were rumors that his appearance was the result of some horrific nuclear accident at the nearby Duquesne power plant. People's concern was real. Others said it was all a lie. But in those days, nearly everyone in the greater Pittsburgh area had heard some version of the urban legend of Charlie No-Face. Some called him the Green Man, others the Beaver County Monster. But the details were essentially the same. Some older Pennsylvania residents even claimed to have met Charlie No-Face when they were young, saying it was by far the scariest moment of their lives. They described it as shaking hands with the Jersey Devil, or sharing a makeup mirror with the bloody and moody Bloody Mary. You thought it was impossible, but there he was, as clear as day, as real as you and me. Because Charlie No-Face did indeed exist, and the story is as terrifying and tragic as one could imagine. On August 16, 1919, an 8-year-old boy named Ray Robinson was walking with his sister and some other friends near Newcastle, Pennsylvania. At one point, the children looked up and saw an attractive bird's nest perched atop a nearby tree. Only this tree was dangerously close to an abandoned railway bridge. It is believed the children were engaging in an activity known as egging, in which they cruelly stole birds' eggs to preserve, paint, or display them. But what Ray didn't know was that, just a year earlier, another child had tried to climb the same tree and managed to touch one of the exposed wires that still had electricity running through it. The boy died after 2 weeks of agony, and Ray was about to make exactly the same nearly fatal mistake. A horrendous amount of electric current surged through young Ray's body, so much that his eyes, lips, nose, and ears were either deformed or completely burned off. One of his arms was rendered useless from the subsequent fall, and one of his hands was torn from his wrist by the force of the electric current. He suffered indescribable pain and agony, but thanks to the hard work of some of the best local doctors, young Ray Robinson miraculously survived. As you can imagine, life became extremely difficult for Ray after the accident, and not just because of his injuries. Many of the large Victorian homes in rural Pennsylvania, including the house where Ray grew up, can truly be something to admire. The extravagant architecture included high ceilings, large windows, and often the privacy of having bathrooms within the bedrooms. In some cases, the level of domestic self-sufficiency meant a person could remain in an isolated corner of the house for days, perhaps even weeks. Just as they provided a sense of comfortable solitude, these features could also become horrible golden cages for people like Ray. And that's how his family kept his monstrous figure hidden from the terrified public. By all accounts, Ray was kept isolated and marginalized, even by his own family. However, he was not entirely mistreated during his upbringing. He was well-fed, and his love for baseball was encouraged by his parents, who provided him with both baseball cards and a wireless radio so he could listen to the games. His parents also understood that he needed to stay busy, and that they should teach him how to function in society. They provided him with the means to learn Braille, and even taught him how to make wallets and rugs out of used rubber tires. When he came of age, his family showed him a renovated apartment they had made for him in the family's garage. It brought him physically and emotionally closer to them, and meant the world to a young man who had been so misunderstood for most of his life. However, as he grew older, a longing for freedom ignited within him. So in a small act of rebellion, Ray escaped from the house in the dead of night and began walking along the road near his home. It became a regular occurrence. He enjoyed the sensation of the asphalt beneath his feet, the breeze on his skin. Over time, his nighttime walks grew from once or twice a week to nearly every night, always alone and always in the dark. And it was then that the real Ray Robinson became a living, breathing urban legend. Most nights, on the rare occasions a car passed by, Ray would be startled by the approaching sound of the engine and dart off the road to hide among the foliage. But after a while, he realized that the roaring vehicles didn't scare him. If he stayed on the roadside, they didn't seem to bother him, so he decided to stop hiding. One day, Ray was walking along the road when once again he heard the sound of an approaching car, but unlike so many previous times when the vehicle simply passed without catching him in its headlights, Ray heard the screech of tires on the road behind him. A man shouted into the night, revving his engine in a way that sounded like he was reversing. Scared, Ray ran off the road and hid among some trees. Ray vowed to stop his nighttime walks for a while, but the damage had already been done. In the nearby town of Elwood, rumors of the faceless man began to spread. The first sighting didn't cause much of a stir. People thought the storyteller was tired, crazy, or drunk. But after a few months, a second sighting of an obviously unsettled Ray Robinson caused some frenzy among the local residents. People began driving down Route 351 once the sun set, desperate to confirm the rumors about Charlie No-Face for themselves. And one by one, the residents of Elwood discovered that the rumors were true. As expected, Ray's unusual appearance was a source of both fascination and repulsion. But for the most part, those who encountered him were not without compassion. People began offering him cigarettes or beer, two pleasures he had never had the fortune or misfortune to try. And like many of us, he discovered he liked them. It also seems he enjoyed being photographed, as there are many confirmed photos of Ray with smiling residents, hugging him as if he were a beloved celebrity. Once again, rumors spread that Charlie No-Face liked beers and cigarettes, and townspeople brought him tributes nearly every night, further encouraging his nightly walks along Route 351. But not everyone who sought him out had good intentions. According to some Elwood residents, Ray was attacked and beaten on more than one occasion. One person even tells the story of how a particularly cruel individual filled a beer bottle with his own urine, chilled it, and then gave it to the blind wanderer during one of his nighttime walks. Some would stop, offer him a ride, and then leave him stranded in the middle of nowhere. Shocking but not surprising, as anyone even minimally familiar with humanity might recall. An older Elwood resident tells the story of one night when he was driving down Wallace Run Road with his friends. They had brought along a pack of beers, some straws, and a few cigarettes, their usual tribute to the Green Man. Though his friends had already seen Charlie No-Face before, our narrator had yet to have the pleasure. And when Ray Robinson finally appeared in person, sitting right next to him, the man said he froze in terror. Everything they said about him was true, and his face was indeed green. It turns out there was a rather somber reason behind that discoloration. Since Ray's nose was essentially an open wound throughout his adult life, he often suffered from quite severe infections, which gave his face a slightly greenish hue. People need to understand, the resident was quoted as saying, that this was a human being, a real person, someone who endured one of the most tragic lives I've ever encountered. Beneath it all was this beautiful, kind man. Somewhere there is a photograph of Ray Robinson posing with a woman. It's clear that she's happy, not afraid. And the way she embraces him shows the affection she feels for a man she may have never met before, all based on a well-deserved reputation for being a kind-spirited person who didn't let a life-changing accident bring him down. There's also an interview with a man whose brother died in combat during the Vietnam War. By his own admission, his fascination with Charlie No-Face was somewhat eccentric, but he also credits Ray Robinson with helping him get through the darkest period of his grief. Ray wasn't just an urban legend, he was a real flesh-and-blood man, and a good one at that. Ray lived in assisted living when he passed away in 1981. His grave is located in Grandview Cemetery at 139 Norwood Drive in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. And interestingly, he is buried just a few graves away from the small boy who was electrocuted in the same way exactly 1 year before Ray's accident. Occasionally, someone stops by to leave fresh flowers at Ray's grave. It's unclear whether it's one person or several, but the message is clear. Ray's legacy lives on. Whether in the scary stories of the faceless man or in the affection shown by those who came to know him, Ray Robinson has left his mark. So, let's raise a toast to Ray Robinson, the urban legend who turned out to be very, very real, and who deserves to rest in the deepest, most heavenly peace. As we all know, sewers are dark, dangerous, and scary places. The fictional home of supervillains, evil clowns, and post-adolescent reptiles trained in ninjutsu. Obviously, there are many unpleasant, disgusting, and dangerous things down there. Rats, used tampons, toilet paper, sewage, you name it. If you flush it down the toilet, it's down there. But what about the infamous colonies of alligators that are so prevalent in urban legends? No doubt this is a claim that has been circulating for decades, and you've probably heard some version of the story that kicked off the urban legend. Supposedly, a spoiled child receives a baby alligator of all things as a birthday present and flushes it down the toilet when he gets bored of playing with it. Years later, as the story goes, the same child reaches into a sewer to retrieve a lost ball, and his arm is ripped off by his former pet, now monstrous and bloodthirsty. Some versions go even further, suggesting that after the alligator was discarded at such a young age, it would live most of its life in an environment without exposure to sunlight, and over time, would lose its sight and skin pigmentation. The reptile is said to grow up blind and completely albino, a pure white color with red or pink eyes. Another reason an albino alligator would retreat to an underground sewer is due to its vulnerability to sunlight in the wild. Without dark pigmentation in its skin, it has no protection against the sun, making survival in the wild extremely difficult. Some have even spoken of mutant alligators living in sewers, exposed to many types of different toxic chemical waste, deforming them and sometimes making them larger and with strange colors. The story is well known and has appeared in many forms, including television shows and horror movies. In fact, questions about the rumors of alligators in sewers regularly reach the offices of New York City's Sewer Bureau, and they are routinely denied. One source of the story is the 1959 book, The World Beneath the City, which includes an interview with a New Yorker who claimed to have been sewer commissioner in the 1930s, when a campaign was carried out to rid the sewers of alligators. This seemed like solid proof that even if there are no longer alligators in the city's sewers, at one time there were, and they posed a big enough threat for the city to launch a program to eradicate them. However, further investigation revealed that the man had never been commissioner and in fact delighted in making up outrageous stories. But beyond all the myths, there is the fact that alligators wouldn't survive very long in sewers. In a 1982 interview with the New York Times, John F.T. Flattery, spokesman for the Sewer Bureau, said, "I could give you a lot of logical and compelling reasons why the sewer system is not a suitable habitat for an alligator, but suffice it to say that in the 28 years I've been in the sewer business, neither I nor any of the thousands of men who have worked to build, maintain, or repair the sewer system have ever seen one. And a 12-foot, 800-pound alligator would be hard to miss. However, New York is a large city known for its eccentricities. Some people have exotic pets, and it's possible that one or more doomed, miserable baby alligators are somewhere. But finding or putting an alligator in a New York City sewer doesn't mean decades of stories about giant alligators in the sewers are true, until you come across a particular case from 2010. An alligator, a crocodile. We were stunned, but it was definitely, well, a pretty reptilian reptile," said New Yorker Joyce Hackett. While returning home in Manhattan, crossing the side streets of Queens, she noticed a crowd of about 30 people gathered around an Old Navy. I rolled down the window and asked an officer what was going on. "An alligator," the officer replied, as if the most important thing was that she should have been on her break. I ducked down and there it was, on the wet asphalt, crouched and still. It wasn't a baby alligator, just 8 inches long. This one was over 2 feet long, but honestly, it seemed less like a threatening predator and more like an abandoned pet hiding under a car, like many of us. Joyce was familiar with the story of alligators in the sewers, but never for a second did she believe it was true. However, when faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary, she had no choice but to give in. The sewers and storm drains in the entire neighborhood were flooded from the storm. Joyce mused, "Maybe a wave swept this creature onto the pavement of civilization, separating it from its group." When asked if she was truly shocked or scared to see the alligator, Joyce could only respond sort of, because New York is a city where one expects the unexpected, a city where alien creatures take root and whose drains, basements, archives, and streams produce more stories than all its writers can imagine. It's a city that, in short, writes itself. Each year, at least half a dozen people ask the New York City Sewer Bureau about those infamous alligators. John T. Flattery, chief designer, routinely answers those inquiries. "I could give you plenty of logical and compelling reasons why the sewer system is not a suitable habitat for an alligator, but suffice it to say that in the 28 years I've been in the sewer business, neither I nor any of the thousands of men who have worked to build, maintain, or repair the system have ever seen one." Flattery, whose sense of humor is dry but lethal, added, "The only clear proof of the absence of alligators is that no union official has ever filed an alligator infestation as a reason to demand a pay raise for sewer workers. Although it's nearly impossible to prove that something didn't happen, I would still suggest that, given the lack of credible sightings, it's safe to assume there aren't any alligators down there." However, despite what Flattery says, between the years 1927 and 1982, there were 13 separate reports from people claiming to have seen alligators in the New York sewer system and its surroundings. The 2-foot baby alligator was captured in 2010 by New York police in the sewers of Queens, and it definitely came from the sewers. However, it's unlikely it had been there for long, as John Flattery is absolutely right in his view that alligators simply couldn't survive there for an extended period due to the winter cold. However, once cold weather is no longer an issue, alligators actually thrive in certain sewer systems and have been seen in the drains and sewers of Florida as recently as 2017. This is because many of those drains empty into swamps during storm overflows, and during the colder winter months, Florida alligators sometimes seek refuge in convenient drains and hunt rats to supplement their diet. So despite what many insist is impossible, there is irrefutable evidence that alligators can live in the sewer systems of the United States. And while it's clear they can't live there long, the sighting of the alligator in the Queens sewers is undoubtedly true. So maybe next time you're near a sewer during heavy rain, be a little cautious, because it's not just Pennywise who might grab your arm before tearing it off. You might find yourself being eaten alive by something you never thought possible. The man who was born as Frank Russian would eventually become known as Andre Rand in his adult life, but the name on his driver's license has become somewhat irrelevant, as his terrifying deeds would be associated with a deceptively playful nickname. Born in New York City on March 11, 1944, Rand would spend most of his life on Staten Island, becoming one of the most infamous criminals the Northeast has ever known. And although Rand was definitely not the most prolific serial killer, it was the nature of his crimes that made him universally despised. You see, Andre Rand's preferred prey was children. Fortunately, Andre Rand is serving multiple consecutive sentences of 25 years to life, but this convicted kidnapper and alleged child serial killer managed to cause enough havoc and pain in his time that his capture and imprisonment provide very little comfort. However, curiously, the fascinating and morbid story of this man began as a campfire tale come to life. A long time ago, the youth of Staten Island would scare each other by telling stories of a monstrous figure known only as Cropsey. Supposedly a sort of boogeyman with a razor-sharp steel hook for a hand, Cropsey would apparently drag innocent children from their homes in the middle of the night before taking them to an abandoned hospital. Depending on who told the story, you would be tortured, killed, eaten, or any combination of the three. While campfire tales and scary urban legends are an exciting part of almost everyone's childhood, for the children of Staten Island, these ominous stories soon became disturbingly real. The line between fiction and reality began to blur when local children started to disappear in real life. And when their cold, lifeless bodies were found, it became clear that this wasn't just a campfire tale. Could it be that Cropsey was real? During the 1960s, Andre Rand worked as a janitor at the state-funded Willowbrook State School. Willowbrook was a charitable center that provided help to children with disabilities. On the surface, everything about Willowbrook's practices seemed good and proper, but upon closer inspection, state officials began to unravel a web of questionable conditions and unethical medical practices. Acting on the advice of inspectors, Willowbrook was shut down immediately, and Andre Rand was forced to seek new employment. Rand had a clean record, and he could have sought any kind of unskilled work, but instead he chose to follow a much more terrifying path. Between the closure of Willowbrook in the early 1970s, several young girls disappeared in the area surrounding the abandoned hospital. The first was 5-year-old Alice Pereira on July 10, 1972. The cheerful, carefree girl seemed to have vanished into thin air while playing on the street just outside her home, a street located only a few miles southeast of the old Willowbrook Hospital. For a while, the whereabouts of the little girl remained a complete mystery. There was something the local residents didn't know, that Andre Rand had once been called Frank Russian, and Frank Russian had spent 10 months in prison for the abduction of several young children. The fact that he served only 10 months is due to his defense lawyer successfully negotiating a charge of false imprisonment, a crime with a significantly lighter sentence than kidnapping or unlawful restraint. But the conviction was enough to stain Frank's name forever, so he came up with a fairly simple and clever solution. He changed his name, and after moving to Staten Island, he became Andre Rand. However, while Rand could hide his identity from the townspeople, he couldn't hide his identity from the police officers, who were well aware of his legal name change. So when little Alice Pereira disappeared on that warm July afternoon, the police considered Rand the prime suspect. Despite their convictions, The evidence was flimsy and not strong enough to secure a firm conviction in a court of law. And so, while the police decided to wait, the bodies began to pile up. On July 15, 1981, 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes disappeared. Her parents filed a missing persons report, while several witnesses claimed to have seen the girl with Rand shortly before her disappearance. Once again, no real evidence was found, and no arrests were made. 2 years later, Rand was again the prime suspect when 11-year-old Tyhees Jackson disappeared. Then, in 1984, 21-year-old Hank Gafario also went missing. These disturbing incidents left local residents gripped with terror, a fear that was compounded by the fact that not a single person had been arrested, and no clear motive existed for so much suffering. 3 long years passed before local police finally got a lead in their investigation. When 12-year-old Jennifer Schweiger was reported missing on July 9, 1987, the search for her or her body lasted 35 days and ended with the tragic discovery of her body in a shallow grave in a wooded area of Staten Island. According to the New York Times, Schweiger was found dead in a shallow grave on the old Willowbrook State School property. By the time Jenny Schweiger's body was found, the police decided they had to act, and Andre Rand was arrested and charged as the suspect in the murder. Once again, prosecutors faced challenges in the judicial process and found they could not convict Rand on the murder charge, as there was only enough evidence to irrefutably convict him of kidnapping. This was in 1988, and prosecutors had Rand exactly where they wanted him, in a federal penitentiary, where he would spend time while they worked on convicting him for the other child murders. Although there wasn't enough evidence at the time, Rand was convicted of the kidnapping of Holly Ann Hughes in 2004, more than 2 decades after she disappeared. And since there is no statute of limitations in New York State for first-degree kidnapping, prosecutors ensured that Rand wouldn't escape justice for his historical depravities. He was given an additional 25 years to life sentence on top of the one he was already serving. In short, Staten Island's boogeyman remains behind bars to this day for the kidnappings of Holly Ann Hughes and Jennifer Schweiger, and he will not be eligible for parole until 2037 if he lives that long. He will be 93 years old the day he is set free. The disturbing life and legacy of Andre Rand were analyzed in the 2019 documentary Cropsey. The film premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival that year and won the Grand Jury Prize for its gripping narrative and polished production quality. And upon watching it, it's easy to understand why. The essential premise of the film was to explore whether the urban legend of Cropsey on Staten Island was truly related to Rand's murderous career, whether one fed into the other until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. However, as the film showed, for some of the people who lived through those years on Staten Island, as well as those involved in the search for the missing children, the term boogeyman doesn't fully capture the despicable psychopathy of Rand. Donna Coutinho, president of the charity Friends of Jennifer for Missing Children, calls Rand the Hannibal Lecter of Staten Island. Donna and her fellow volunteers have the thankless task of searching for undiscovered remains in Willowbrook's 385 acres twice a year. He terrorized an entire community and he still haunts us, Donna said in a quote. For some kids, it's like, if Cropsey was real, what else aren't they telling us? And I don't know, sometimes I feel a bit of that too. In the end, Andre Rand was arrested, imprisoned, and may never see the light of day again. But even so, his impact on the Staten Island community is immeasurable, and Cropsey has left a massive psychological trauma that may well last for generations. Some of those children are still missing. Their remains are still out there somewhere, and as the years pass and their bones are unearthed one by one from the cold ground that surrounds them, the memories of Rand's reign of terror will resurface again and again. And perhaps that's what makes the story of Cropsey so truly terrifying. The central lesson of the story, the frightening core of its message, is that the boogeyman is real and he wears the face of men. Ironically, one of the most horrifying urban legends is perhaps one of the least known, at least in the United States. However, in Toronto, Canada, almost everyone has heard the story of the flying lawyer. According to the legend, a wealthy lawyer was overly enthusiastic about showing off all the features of his extravagant office, located in a massive glass skyscraper. The company that manufactured the large glass windows in the office boasted that their windows were unbreakable, and that it would take a cannon shot to break them. Apparently, this wealthy lawyer was a fanatic about proving this was true and had a rather terrifying office trick that he would use to impress his guests. Just when the party was at its peak, he would take a running start and jump toward the glass windows after announcing, "Goodbye, cruel world." Guests would scream in horror as they watched the lawyer hurl himself toward the window, only to be met by his hysterical laughter when he bounced harmlessly off the tough, polished glass. Again and again, the lawyer would repeat his daring feat until one day, the unthinkable happened. The unbreakable broke. The lawyer took a running start, rushed toward the glass, excited by the screams of the newcomers, but when his large body slammed into the glass, it shattered. Instead of turning to laugh at those who had fallen for the prank, the lawyer was only accompanied by the sound of his own screams as he fell 20 stories to his death. It's an urban legend that has it all. The impossible becomes possible, the arrogant are punished, and it's as theatrical as urban legends come. However, perhaps the real horror only sets in when we find out that the entire story is completely and absolutely true. After completing a degree in engineering before attending law school, Gary Hoy got a job practicing corporate and securities law in the Canadian city of Toronto. He worked for a firm known as Holden Day Wilson, a law firm located on the 24th floor of the Toronto Dominion Center. Then, on July 9, 1993, Hoy noticed someone giving a tour of the office to a group of law students from a nearby university. As he had done many times before, he attempted to demonstrate the strength of the building's window glass by throwing himself against one of them. To scare the students, Hoy took his usual running start and hurled himself against the glass. Here's where the urban legend differs from the real story. It turns out the glass was truly unbreakable and it didn't shatter, not even on the day of Hoy's death. Instead, some old rusty screws, tired of Hoy's continued abuse, simply gave way and allowed the window pane to slide out of place. Right in front of the completely unsuspecting students, Gary Hoy screamed as he fell through the gap left by the window and plummeted 24 floors to his death. The building's structural engineer, Bob Greer, was contacted by the Toronto Star to give his opinion. Upon hearing about Hoy's recklessness, he was quoted as saying, "I don't know of any building code in the world that allows a 160-pound man to run against a window like that. He must have been out of his damn mind." In another interview, the company that manufactured the glass was quick to state that the windows didn't actually break. "We just want to make that clear. It fell out of the frame. That's what caused Mr. Hoy's fall a bad installation job, not our product." Holden Day. Wilson never recovered from Hoy's death, and it was definitely one of the contributing factors to the firm's eventual closure less than 3 years later. At the time, it was the largest law firm dissolution in Canadian history, but the national newspapers seemed to forget that Hoy's death had happened. The firm's closure was attributed to poor management and financial discrepancies, and the fact that Gary's ghost had haunted everyone who witnessed his death was completely ignored. Perhaps this is because the story was referenced so often in fictional media, mentioned in TV shows and movies, that people simply assumed it was the invention of some writer with too much imagination, and we can understand why. The tale is truly terrifying, something we'd prefer to tell ourselves didn't happen rather than face the chilling truth that a man actually ended up taking his life because of a stupid prank. You've just sat down on the old porcelain throne and are getting comfortable, ready to relieve yourself. A certain serenity surrounds you in this moment of privacy, comfort, and isolation. The more vulgar among us might even describe the sensation of emptying our bowels as pleasant, and although it can be both repulsive and satisfying at the same time, there's no doubt that sitting on the toilet with your pants around your ankles is one of the most vulnerable positions a person can find themselves in. And for some, that vulnerability might become terrifyingly obvious at some point. It seems impossible, surely, but what if something could swim up through the sewer pipes, slowly slithering or crawling through the dirty toilet water, only to surface just when we're most exposed? Maybe a rat, twitching its fleshy pink tail, rising to the surface with a squeak before lunging teeth first at our behind. Or a snake slithering through the pipes before sinking its fangs into, you know where. Or perhaps an alligator floating in the toilet, waiting for us to arrive and lift the lid so it can bite off a limb or two. Most of us have had some sort of irrational thought like this while sitting on the toilet. But rats, snakes, or alligators can't really swim through our pipes, right? I mean, that has to be just an urban legend. Well, I'm sorry to break it to you folks, but it's true. Rats have been swimming up sewer pipes and into people's toilets with frightening frequency for as long as sewer systems have existed. Magnolia is the second largest neighborhood in Seattle, occupying a hilly peninsula northwest of downtown. It was named by U.S. Coast Survey Captain George Davidson in 1856, who supposedly mistook the numerous madrone trees for magnolias. Given how early it was founded, some sections of Magnolia have a very archaic sewer system. Although these pipes are made of much heavier metals, some might argue that the older sewer pipes are as strong as modern polymer ones. The only problem is they're quite different, and being larger has its downsides, as one unfortunate resident discovered to their absolute horror one night. Obviously, they approached their toilet with the intention of relieving themselves before heading to bed, but when they lifted the lid, the sight that greeted them made their blood run cold. Staring back at them with cold, beady eyes and sharp yellow teeth was a soaking, wet, enormous sewer rat. The scream that must have escaped the unsuspecting homeowner was likely loud enough to wake the dead, as the squealing beast leapt from the toilet in an attempt to escape. It seemed to cover its retreat with a sudden attack and managed to force the homeowner back far enough to make a clean getaway from the bathroom. The owner was left stunned and horrified, crying on the bathroom floor after such a terrible surprise. "I now feel completely unsafe in my own home," the homeowner said in a letter to the King County Department of Public Health. Local media contacted a man named Don Pache, a rodent control specialist with the King County Department of Public Health. "It's a life-changing experience if it happens to you," he said, admitting that incidents are much more common than we're led to believe. "It scares you because you don't expect it." In King County alone, there have been more than 400 reported incidents of sewer rats appearing in people's toilets over the past 10 years, with Pace saying his department handles between 50 and 80 cases of rats in toilets a year. Notoriously known as carriers of the infamous Black Plague, rats are one of the most detested and ubiquitous urban pests, and certainly it doesn't help their reputation when they invade the privacy of people's bathrooms. Pace has been helping people get rid of rats in toilets for more than 20 years in King County. Occurrences of rats in toilets are now so regular in some parts of the Pacific Northwest that Don has created a webpage to help people deal with the problem. "We try to tell people not to panic. All you have to do is close the lid and flush. The rat will try to swim back or get tired and drown," said Pace. "It may take more than one flush to exile the furry intruders." Typically, Norway rats measure between 6 and 8 inches long, or 12 inches if you include the tail. So it's no easy task to flush them down, let me tell you. "Sometimes I feel like a superhero because everyone's so happy to see me," he said. Usually, he continued, the story goes something like this. Someone hears a splashing sound at 1:30 in the morning in the toilet. They go to check and find a rat swimming in circles. However, in 5 minutes, it's gone. There's water everywhere and no sign of any obvious entry point. It seems impossible, but it happens often, and there's very little we can do about it, aside from dealing with the incidents when they arise. Some public complaints to the King County Department of Public Health are available online. One read, "I have the unfortunate duty of reporting that I found a rat in my toilet tonight on July 1st, 2013. It's alive and not too happy to be where it is. I'll try using liquid soap and flushing. If that doesn't work, I guess I'll look for some thick leather gloves and see if I can pull it out that way." "My wife heard scratching noises in the toilet," said another complaint. "She lifted the lid and saw a rat. She screamed, flushed 3 times, and the rat disappeared. Then she sprayed liquid soap into the toilet and flushed 2 more times. Then she poured bleach down the kitchen sink, followed by boiling water." Don Pache said he approves of the liquid soap method mentioned above. The soap breaks the surface tension in the toilet bowl and makes it harder for the rat to swim. But the measures don't stop there. If someone reports a rat in the toilet to the county, Pace typically leaves poison in a nearby sewer to target other rats that may be considering an invasion. "Probably the best thing to do is avoid attracting rats in the first place," said Don. "Rats normally chase after food that is poured down the drain but divert their route to the toilet because they can't access the sink. They come up where they find the easiest access, the toilet bowl. Every house has a sink, so every house has an entry point for rats. This happens all over Seattle, from the south end to the north end," he said. Don recommends cleaning drains regularly, preferably using a cup of baking soda, a cup of vinegar, and a healthy dose of boiling water. It's particularly important to do this in summer and fall, as that's when rats are naturally more active. But that said, incidents are still rare overall. And the more modern your pipes, the less likely a rat in the toilet incident is to occur. So, rest easy, friends. The chances of actually finding a rat sitting in your toilet are relatively low. But I'm sorry to say it does happen. So maybe we should all start keeping the toilet lid closed to keep sewer rats out. But if you do, remember that every time you lift the lid, you'll be playing roulette with the possibility of being ambushed by a large, angry critter. Many of us are familiar with the urban legend of Bloody Mary, the idea that if you look into a mirror and say her name a certain number of times, a malevolent ghost known as Bloody Mary will materialize to kill you. Some might say that the Candyman movie series borrowed this concept, with the protagonist looking into a mirror while repeating the main character's name as a means of invoking him. Undoubtedly, it's a terrifying trope, the idea of looking into a mirror only for someone or something to suddenly appear behind you. It's enough to make even the bravest of us shudder. But no one has actually ever suddenly appeared from someone's mirror to kill them, right? Those of you who prefer to remain blissfully ignorant, I implore you to stop reading right now. But for the rest of you, who don't mind being a little paranoid over the next few days, let me introduce you to the story of Ruthie Mae McCoy. At around 8:45 p.m. on April 22, 1987, Ruthie Mae McCoy made a 911 call from her 11th floor apartment in the ABLA housing complex on West 13th Street in Chicago. After the police dispatcher asked Ruthie what kind of help she needed, her response was incredibly puzzling. In essence, Ruthie said someone was trying to break into her home through the bathroom cabinet. "They want to come in," she said. "From where?" asked the dispatcher. "They want to come in through my bathroom," Ruthie replied. "I'm on the other side. They're trying to come through my bathroom cabinet." The dispatcher had already established that Ruthie was on the 11th floor of a high-rise building on 13th Street. There was no way someone could be climbing through the bathroom window, and absolutely no way they could use her bathroom cabinet as some kind of door. The dispatcher was certainly concerned for Ruthie's safety, but it seemed that the biggest threat to her well-being was herself. She sounded scared, that was clear. But if she truly believed people were trying to break into her apartment through her bathroom cabinet, she must be having some kind of mental crisis. The dispatcher told Ruthie that the police were on their way but logged the call as a neighbor disturbance rather than an assault in progress. It wasn't a high-priority call, but eventually the police would arrive to check on her situation. When the police finally arrived at Ruthie's apartment, they knocked on the door but got no answer. After their knocks went unanswered, they tried to enter using a key provided by a housing office employee, but they left when the key failed to unlock the door. The next night, Chicago police received a call from one of Ruthie's neighbors, concerned about her whereabouts after seeing the police at her door the night before, and still not having seen Ruthie. Chicago police and security guards from the Chicago Housing Authority, CHA, returned to McCoy's apartment shortly after. After knocking and calling out without getting any response, the officers suggested breaking down the door, but they were incredibly stopped by the CHA security guards, who told them they would sue the city for damages if they lost their jobs. The following night, pressure from the police forced the Chicago Housing Authority to act, and they sent a representative with a carpenter who drilled the lock on the door. That's when they made a horrific discovery: the dead and decomposing body of Ruthie Mae McCoy. Homicide detectives found that she had been shot in the left shoulder, left thigh, right side of the abdomen, and upper right arm. It also became obvious that whoever had shot Ruthie Mae knew her and had gained access to her apartment without needing to force entry. However, they discovered that Ruthie had locked her door from the inside, and the key was still hanging near the threshold. So, how had they gotten in and out of the apartment? The detectives reviewed the 911 call Ruthie made on the night of her death, when she mentioned that her killers were trying to enter through the bathroom cabinet. A deep chill ran through the two men. It seemed impossible, like something out of a horror movie, but there had to be a rational explanation for what Ruthie was saying, since she obviously wasn't imagining someone in her mirror. The detectives returned to the crime scene, determined to thoroughly investigate the bathroom cabinet Ruth had mentioned. At first glance, it looked like a regular bathroom cabinet with a mirrored door, a sterile white interior dotted with cosmetics and medicines. There were no secret doors inside it, and certainly no supernatural portals to otherworldly infernal realms. In a mild display of frustration, one of the detectives shook or tapped the cabinet, only for both to notice something curious. The cabinet visibly moved. We can imagine the moment one detective looked in surprise at the other before moving the cabinet again. It didn't take long before they discovered they could do more than just move it. They could remove it entirely, revealing a large hole in the wall. It turns out that the ABLA housing projects where Ruthie lived had an unusual architectural quirk. Some apartments were connected to each other through a narrow tunnel that ran behind the bathroom cabinets of opposite units. This design was intended to provide easy access to plumbing in case maintenance was needed. In some cases, the apartments above and below were also connected in a similar fashion. While this made workers' jobs easier, it also made it easy for burglars and other nefarious individuals to gain access, as the bathroom cabinets were easily removable from either side. A person could simply remove the cabinet from the wall of the apartment they were in, crawl through the narrow passageway known as a pipe chase, and push the cabinet of the apartment they were trying to access out of the way. Break-ins through this method had been occurring in the ABLA projects for some time by the time of Ruthie's murder. So much so that residents would place furniture in front of their bathroom doors or tie them shut with ropes before going to sleep. Clearly, it was a major problem, but one that had been completely overlooked in the construction of the housing projects. Until the Chicago Housing Authority could find the money to fix it, residents were told they would just have to deal with it. Ruthie's apartment, number 1109, was connected to number 1108, and it was obviously from there that her killers emerged. Apartment 1108 was being rented at the time, and it's believed that the registered tenant was actually a drug dealer who allowed his customers to use the apartment as a drug den. These troubled individuals either heard about the architectural flaw or discovered it for themselves and decided to use it to their advantage. Two ABLA residents, 18-year-old Ted Turner and a 21-year-old man named John Honduras, were charged with murder, home invasion, armed robbery, armed violence, and residential burglary. Several witnesses claimed to have seen the two men carrying McCoy's 19-inch color TV and rocking chair through the projects in the hours after Ruthie's murder. After years of arrests and continued investigations, the charges against the two men were dropped for lack of evidence, and Ruthie's killers were never officially charged or imprisoned. Even without the supernatural element, the idea that someone could violently break into your apartment through what amounts to a secret passageway is absolutely terrifying. Very few of us have ever seen the blueprints of the apartment buildings or houses we live in. And even if you're interested in doing so, how do you know for sure that there isn't some kind of hidden entrance to your apartment? And if there is, how do you know that someone isn't sliding through it at this very moment, ready to pounce on some poor fan of horror stories and give them their own personal tale of terror? You may have heard of the urban legend sometimes known as the body under the bed. The legend tells the story of a couple on vacation, staying at a cheap roadside motel, only to discover a foul odor in their room. During the night, the stench becomes so unbearable that they can't sleep, and they decide to call a staff member to complain. The staff member then discovers that the bad smell is coming from the bed, and upon looking under the frame, they find that the couple had been sleeping above the decomposing body of a young woman who had been stuffed into the base of the bed. It's undoubtedly one of the lesser-known urban legends, but it's all the more terrifying because it's actually a true story. Not only that, but there have been multiple cases of people sleeping in rooms where bodies have been hidden, and two of those unfortunate souls were James and Rhonda Sargent. The couple had been on the road for hours before checking into room 222 at the Budget Lodge Inn on Brooks Road in Memphis, Tennessee. That night, the couple said they complained to the motel staff because the room smelled terrible. They lit some incense they had bought from a nearby hippie store, but nothing seemed to cover up the disgusting odor. It seemed like someone had already tried, as the sergeants noticed that dryer sheets had been stuffed into the ceiling tiles and corners, and the smell was stronger every time someone sat on the bed. It was perhaps the worst night's sleep of their lives, and the next morning the couple left the motel determined never to return. Sometime later, the foul odor had attracted enough negative attention that the motel owners finally decided to call the police. More than one guest had commented that it smells like a dead body in there, in room 222, and they weren't wrong. The homicide detectives immediately recognized the smell as coming from a corpse, and after flipping the room upside down, they found the decomposing body of Soni Millbrook, a 28-year-old mother of 4. During the course of the police investigation that followed, it was discovered that Sony had checked into the Budget Inn sometime in January of 2010. She had been staying with her boyfriend, Lakeith Moody, the father of 4 of her children, and the room was in her name. Millbrook had been there for a few weeks when one day in late January, she didn't pick up her children from daycare. Her sister, Linda James, reported her missing. The police believe she died on the same day she disappeared, but motel workers said they bagged Millbrook's personal belongings and cleaned the room. The workers said nothing seemed to be missing, and the room was rented out again. If Sony had been the victim of a crime, it certainly didn't seem to have happened at the Budget Inn, or at least, that's how it appeared. After Sony's body was found, Lakeith Moody was detained while driving Millbrook's car and was arrested on federal charges of being a felon in possession of a firearm. It wasn't until his trial in 2014 that he was convicted of the murder of his child's mother, and he was automatically sentenced to life in prison in accordance with state law. I'm in shock because I'm like, okay, I laid on top of this lady's body, said Rhonda Sargent, who stayed in the room after Millbrook's disappearance and before her body was found. This is someone's daughter, someone's mother. Why didn't they investigate this thoroughly? She added. I think I would have checked everywhere, said her husband James. I think I would have known to look under the bed. But they didn't, nor did the police. It was already clear. Talk about ruining the crime scene, said Memphis Police Director Larry Godwin in March. The room had also been rented out several times with almost no complaints. It was like, well, we don't have any evidence here. Officers wanted to solve it, which is why they took a different direction. Whether due to misfortune or simply incompetence on the part of the investigating police, it's impossible to judge, but one thing is clear. An alarming number of people have actually slept in beds under which a corpse had been hidden. So the next time you're on the road and stop for the night at a roadside motel, make sure there's nothing masking a particularly unpleasant smell. And as always, check under the bed, because apparently, you never really know when you might be sleeping with an unexpected roommate. We've been doing urban explorations for our YouTube channel for quite some time. We'd go to abandoned buildings, factories, hospitals, you name it. People loved watching us enter these places, defying the forbidden. We weren't superstitious idiots. We just wanted good views and a few scares for the camera. The scarier the place, the more views we got. That's when Kyle mentioned Bell Cave. Bell Cave had a very peculiar history. It wasn't just another forgotten place. About 200 years ago, the Bell family, one of the most well-known in the region, began having problems. Animals would show up dead on their land, strange noises were heard in the house, and family members started to fall ill. The worst was when the youngest daughter, Betsy, began suffering violent attacks from something they could never see. Some said it was a witch, others a spirit. In the end, the patriarch, John Bell, died, and many claimed it was the work of the Bell Witch. What no one could deny was that something horrible had happened there. Some versions said that the spirit or witch lived in a nearby cave, where she had been hiding all along. There were rumors of people entering, but no one ever came out to tell the tale. Of course, all that sounded like exaggerated legends, typical stories to scare tourists or keep kids away. I don't believe in that nonsense, neither did Kyle or Derek. But if we filmed inside the famous cave, the video would blow up our channel. So without much more thought, we agreed to do it. Halloween was the perfect night. People would be busy with their costumes, and we could work without being disturbed. Kyle brought the gear, Derek, as usual, brought his knife, and I carried the cameras. We parked near the woods and walked the rest of the way with our flashlights. The place was far from everything. It wasn't a tourist attraction. The stories kept most people away, and the few curious ones who ventured there, you never heard from them again. Finally, we reached the entrance of the cave. Nothing impressive, just a hole in the rock. There was nothing special about it. No strange aura or anything like that, just a cave. Let's do this quickly and get out of here. I want to get home early. Once inside, Kyle was filming as we walked, narrating a bit for the video. Nothing we found was unusual or interesting. The cave extended much further than we thought, but the deeper we went, the more bored I became. The video was going to need a lot of editing to make it more exciting. And then we heard it. A noise. It was subtle, barely audible, but enough to make the three of us fall silent. We all stood still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It was like something scratching softly, like nails running over stone. I looked at Kyle, who was holding the camera, but he seemed just as confused. "Careful, guys, it might be an animal." Kyle decided to shine his flashlight further ahead. The beam of light caught something moving. At first I thought it was a shadow, but it wasn't. It was a thin, hunched figure moving quickly in the darkness. "What the hell is that?" Kyle took a step back, and the thing disappeared deeper into the cave. Without thinking, we began to walk quickly toward the cave's exit. It wasn't a full-on run, but we weren't interested in exploring further. Something was there, and it wasn't an animal. It couldn't be. None of us said the word witch, but we were all thinking it. The sound continued, closer, more insistent. That thing wasn't attacking us head-on. It was just following us, toying with us. It moved quickly, too quickly between the rocks, disappearing before we could focus on it with the lights. Whatever it wasn't in a hurry. Then everything turned to chaos. Something pounced on Kyle so fast that I didn't have time to react. I saw him hit the ground, screaming. Derek and I backed up, unable to do anything. That thing had him. Kyle's flashlight danced on the floor as he was dragged into the darkness. I couldn't fully see what had him, but I could hear it. Kyle's bones crunching, his flesh tearing. I didn't stay to watch anymore. Derek and I ran. Kyle's screams faded quickly within seconds. I heard another scream. It was Derek calling my name from behind, but I ignored him and kept running. I wasn't thinking about anything else, I just ran. Derek's screams were suddenly cut off, complete silence. It was like someone had flipped a switch. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what had happened to him. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to keep running. But then a new sound filled the space, a dry crunching noise, like a body being dragged across the ground. Something was moving toward me, and this time it wasn't bothering to hide. Finally, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. I was almost at the exit, and the noise behind me had stopped. I had lost it. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. I couldn't take another step, but then I saw her. She was there, waiting for me. She was huge, humanoid, but barely recognizable as something that was once human. Her skin was white, almost translucent. Her body twisted at impossible angles, as if someone had purposely deformed her. Her limbs were long and thin, far too long for a human. But the worst part was her head, large, bald, with two sunken, lifeless eyes, black as coal. Her mouth was enormous, hanging open with long, sharp teeth that didn't seem to fit right in her jaw. She looked at me. She didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. I could feel her hunger. In that moment, I felt like nothing more than prey. This was something real, something made to hunt and kill. If the legend was true and this had once been human, that was long gone. Before I could react, she moved. She was incredibly fast for her size. She lunged at me, her mouth wide open, ready to tear out my throat. I grabbed a rock from the ground, the only weapon I had, and threw it with all my strength. It didn't do much, but I hit her in the face hard enough to make her step back a few paces. I took advantage of the moment and started running again. I could hear her behind me, moving fast, getting closer and closer. The cave's exit was near. I could still hear her behind me, breathing heavily, almost smelling my fear. She was closer than I had imagined. I knew she would catch up with me at any second. Suddenly, I felt her long, cold fingers on my shoulder, pulling me back. I fell face first to the ground, hitting my head on the rock. My vision blurred for a moment, but I could still hear her. Her breathing was deep and slow, like she was savoring the moment. I turned my head, and there she was, crouching over me, her enormous mouth opening, getting closer to my face. Desperate, I fought with everything I had, kicking and struggling. I managed to break free from her grip by pure instinct and crawled as fast as I could toward the light coming from the cave's entrance. I could feel her right behind me, brushing against my heels, but I didn't stop. I don't know how I did it, but I made it out. I escaped. Once I reached the light, the witch stopped chasing me. I got up and ran to Kyle's truck without stopping or looking back. I started the engine and drove like a madman toward the town, my body trembling and my head spinning. Then I told everything to the police. They never started a search, saying that Kyle and Derek had probably gotten lost, that it was an accident. The police knew something, I was sure, but they looked at me with faces that said they weren't going to help. They were faces that blamed us for going to that place. And that's when I realized what was happening in that town. Everyone knew the legend of the witch was real, and we weren't the first victims, nor would we be the last. My name is Fabian, and I've worked as a cemetery caretaker at Bachelor's Grove Cemetery for nearly 10 years. It's not a job many people would seek out, but I like the peace and quiet. There's something about the solitude of this place that I find almost therapeutic. Well, except for Halloween. It's the worst night of the year for anyone in my position. Teenagers think it's fun to sneak in, pull pranks, and record videos for their social media. I get it, people are morbid, and this cemetery has a reputation. The lady in white isn't a new myth. Some tourists even come asking about her, convinced they'll see her if they walk the dirt paths after dark. I've always wondered what makes someone believe in such nonsense, but hey, I'm just the guy who makes sure the graves aren't vandalized and that no one walks where they shouldn't. That Halloween night was my second night as the cemetery's caretaker. You could say I was still a rookie. I was ready for another long shift, and I wasn't going to let any group of brats ruin my day. The weather was perfect for scaring away anyone who didn't belong. Cold, dark, and a full moon that lit up the cemetery, making me less reliant on my flashlight. My shift began, and the hours passed in silence, which irritated me. The other guards had already warned me that silence wasn't normal for Halloween, and they told me that if everything was too quiet, something bad was probably happening. I was expecting to hear the distant laughter and shouts of teenagers getting into trouble, but this time, nothing was happening. Maybe I was overreacting. Everything seemed pretty normal considering I was guarding a cemetery, but as I walked between the graves, I heard something that, at first, I thought my mind had made up. A baby crying. I froze. I looked around but didn't see anyone. The sound came from far away, sharp and clear. It was time. At that moment, I knew it was a prank. I wasn't scared for even a second. I wondered how they'd done it. Maybe they'd hidden a phone playing the sound to waste my time. Today's kids are pretty clever when they want to pull pranks. However, as the crying continued, I felt a discomfort I couldn't shake. It was too real. The baby's cry didn't sound distorted or like it came from speakers. I followed the sound, walking faster, annoyed, but also feeling something I couldn't explain. When I reached the spot where the crying was coming from, I saw a small bundle wrapped in blankets placed on an old tombstone. It couldn't be real. I approached slowly, never taking my eyes off the bundle. At first I thought it was a toy, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. If someone had left a baby as a prank, it was in very poor taste. I tried to get closer for a better look when suddenly a woman dressed in white appeared out of nowhere and grabbed the baby. My first instinct was to shout, "Enough with the pranks! This isn't funny!" The woman didn't respond. She walked slowly, the baby in her arms as if she hadn't heard my words. I could barely see her face under the white veil covering it. "I'm going to call the police. You'd better end this now. You've had your fun. You'll make a great YouTube video." She didn't stop. She headed behind a large old mausoleum, one I rarely visited. I quickened my pace, convinced I'd find her, but when I turned the corner, she was gone, as if she'd never been there. I stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The baby's crying had also stopped. The entire atmosphere started to feel suffocating, like the air had gotten heavier, the same sensation you might feel near a furnace or in a factory. I ran around the mausoleum and checked every corner, but there was no trace of her. Worst of all, I no longer believed it was a prank. What I had witnessed was too real to be a simple joke, and that scared me more than anything else. I decided to head back to my post, but halfway there the baby's cry returned. It was the same sharp sound that had led me to that grave. This time I hesitated to follow it. Every instinct told me not to. However, the possibility that a baby was truly in danger overpowered my fears. I walked slowly, following the sound, which led me back to the mausoleum where I had seen the woman disappear. The place was darker than usual. My flashlight barely lit the area, and the moonlight didn't reach that spot, which seemed to be covered by the mausoleum's shadows. The crying now came from inside. I approached the small broken window to look inside, hoping to see something that would explain all of this. What I saw, or rather, what I felt, was pure terror. From the darkness of the mausoleum, a hand emerged, a rotting hand with hanging flesh and long nails. Before I could react, that hand grabbed my face with inhuman strength and started dragging me inside. The hole in the window was too small, but the demon holding me didn't seem to notice. It pushed and pulled me with a strength I had never felt before. My head banged against the metal door of the mausoleum as the demon kept pulling me. The pain was unbearable. I tried to scream, but the hand covered my mouth, squeezing tighter and tighter. I felt the skin of my face tearing, and the metallic taste of my own blood filled my mouth. I knew I wouldn't survive much longer if this continued. I banged on the door so many times that I began to lose consciousness. My body gave in, and the demon finally let me go. I fell to the ground. I didn't feel any pain anymore, but that was bad. After so many blows, I should have felt something, but I had been hit so hard that I was on the verge of passing out. I could barely move, barely breathe, but I was still conscious. I saw the mausoleum door open slowly. From the ground, my blurred vision showed me a figure in a white dress emerging from the mausoleum. Pale, barefoot legs approached me, and then everything went black. I woke up with a start at my work post. At first I thought I was still in the mausoleum, but soon I realized I was in my little booth where I sat during my shift. Before I could react, I let out a terrible scream. There was a face in front of me. As soon as I screamed, the face looking at me jumped in surprise too. They were teenagers standing in front of me, and they ran off as soon as I reacted. I stood up with difficulty, still confused by what had happened. I touched my face with my hands, searching for wounds, but there was nothing. Not a single mark. It had all been a damn dream. The most terrifying and real dream I had ever experienced. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling, and went out for another round. I walked aimlessly until I reached the mausoleum where I had dreamed that dream. I approached the door, and as if coming out of a trance, I saw the inscription on the mausoleum and remembered where I was standing. At that moment, I noticed something I couldn't understand how I had forgotten. That tombstone had a name and a date, but what disturbed me most was the image on it. It was a woman with a white veil and a baby in her arms. It was the famous mausoleum of the Lady in White. At that moment, I thought I heard a baby crying from inside, though only for a second. All I could do was turn around and leave. In that moment, I missed the teenagers.